Good afternoon and welcome to another webinar from XAMPP HR. I'm Christian Robbins, your webinar host today and presenter. Today we'll be talking a little bit about avoiding the common pitfalls of harassment. Now, if you're not familiar with me, I am the HR and Safety Manager here at XAMPP HR. I've worked in several management, HR, and safety positions. Managed up to 250 people at a time as regional manager for a large distribution center. Had an opportunity to work in heavy manufacturing as safety and HR director. And I worked in several other industries as well as consulting on management, safety, and HR for the last 20 years. But today we're going to focus in on harassment and discrimination. The objectives of this webinar are that after the conclusion of this webinar, you will be able to define harassment, know the different types of harassment, recognize harassment and discrimination in the workplace, be able to conduct yourself in a way that does not harass or discriminate, and we'll also talk a little bit about the term reasonable person and what that means related to harassment. So the definition of illegal harassment is conduct or actions towards a protected class severe or pervasive enough to create a hostile, abusive, or intimidating work environment for a reasonable person. The protected classes that we talk about so much in harassment are race, age, religion, the disabled, gender, genetic information, national origin, and military or veteran status. Now, many of these forms of harassment have been around and been focused on in society for years. Some of them are quite new. Discrimination due to a protected class or status includes sexist conduct, racist conduct, also sexual orientation or gender identity issues. Racist conduct. This is one of the ones that I would consider easier. Very straightforward. Use of racial terms or name calling. Use of racial figures of speech. Racial or cultural joke telling. Segregating employees based upon race, or making fun of a coworker's foreign accent. I know that just a few years ago in the workplace, jokes like this were common, but today they are a problem. Sexual orientation. This is one of the newer issues in harassment. And sexual harassment, teasing or taunting an employee for a real or perceived sexual orientation or gender identity is one of the things that can get us in trouble. Once again, name calling or even just gossiping about or speculating about an individual in the workplace. Religious issues. So with religious issues, making negative comments about a particular religious belief or practice, inappropriate conversations in the workplace on religious topics that alienate those who don't share the same beliefs, or proselytizing, which would be persuading others of your religious beliefs. One of the areas that I see that sometimes there is insensitivity to religious issues is when there is an activity in the workplace, and for religious reasons, there are people that don't partake in certain types of food, and an employer will say, well, these are the foods that we've prepared, these are the foods that we're willing to offer today. If you don't want to participate, that's your choice. Always be aware of the religious beliefs of your employees. And when they come with rational requests, be prepared to fulfill those requests. So there's also discrimination due to disability, gender, and age. Disability-based harassment. This is where we get into more of the gray area of harassment. Someone that has a disability, if they are isolated, if they are not included in the groups, teasing, patronizing comments, the refusal to reasonably accommodate a disabled person, or the reasonable accommodation, but we take that reasonable accommodation and we basically rub it in the face of that disabled person. Oh, we had to make these improvements just so you could work here. That would be the type of disability-based harassment that we would try and avoid in the workplace. Gender association. This is one of the newer harassment topics that we talk about. And this goes along with historical roles for one gender or another. For example, historically, a nurse would have been identified as a female. More and more, there are male nurses. But at one point in society, there would have been the opportunity for someone to tease a male nurse, maybe not being masculine enough. So those are the types of things that we need to be aware of. Gender assigned job titles. This is also a new one. The salesman, the garbage man, the handyman. These are all titles that we should avoid. Probably the most well-known of those in the airline industry, they are not stewardesses or stewards anymore. They are now flight attendants. The other thing that we see sometimes in the workplace is an individual would be passed up for a promotion, and the implication could be there that they're not qualified because of their sex. For example, a capable female manager is passed up for a role in upper management because they lack the leadership skills. What we want to make sure is that we are always promoting the person most qualified for the job, and that we are not discriminating based on that gender association. Age-based harassment. Back in 1964, the Civil Rights Act protected older employees in the workforce. The age that they decided was older in the workforce was 40 years old. Now, today that might not seem like an age group that needs a protected class, but the principle remains the same. With age-based harassments, we always want to avoid making negative comments or references. One of the things that you might see with harassment of older employees in this protected class is if they have not only the age, but also maybe a hearing deficit due to age or disability, and someone gets frustrated and cups their hands to their ears and repeats, huh? Huh? To imitate a person that may be questioning or asking someone to repeat a phrase. Another thing you may see in the workplace that we need to avoid: inappropriate isolation or exclusion of older people. You may have managers that age out of a management role and return to a more production type role where they're not managing other individuals. It's very important that we don't put this person in a situation where they've been included and now they're excluded without following the proper steps. One of the last things that we look at is unfair criticism with age-based discrimination. Age-based discrimination and unfair criticism may be, well, John doesn't understand our modern times because when he started working, there weren't cell phones or the internet. Making comments like that can be interpreted as age-based harassment, so we want to avoid those. So moving on to even more harassment, physical harassment. Now this, almost anyone who's worked has encountered some sort of physical harassment. This would include violence or the threats of violence, horseplay, the destruction of property. I had an opportunity to terminate an employee for the threat of violence. And what happened was this individual had brought their phone to work with pictures of their guns. And they had approached another employee and were showing the pictures of the guns on their phone. And one particular gun they stopped and they said, "This is the gun that I'm going to use to kill." And they named the name of a manager. And then they laughed and turned their phone off and walked away. That is a credible threat of violence. And that is the type of harassment that cannot be tolerated. So make sure that you're looking at that. If you receive those complaints, take them seriously. Take those as a warning sign. With workplace violence on the rise as it is in the United States, these are the types of warning signs we need to be aware of. The other thing we'll see quite often is destruction of property for intimidation. So someone will go to another person's workstation and take something of theirs and break it. This is another type of harassment that must be stopped. Physical harassment oftentimes is assault. In the case of assault, not only should you discipline, but you should also involve law enforcement. Okay? So personal harassment or verbal harassment, these, and what we're going to talk about now, isn't necessarily based on a protected class, but they're actions that can create a hostile work environment. Now, these are items in the workplace that we need to take seriously, because if we don't take them seriously, we may run into situations where employees will complain and complain, and our inaction is what could cause us problems. So these are inappropriate jokes or comments, public humiliation. So take an employee, for example, that is teased and ridiculed publicly, humiliated in front of their peers. Intimidation tactics are used where they will threaten or posture in such a way that the person believes that some harm could come to them. Behaviors that ostracize or cast out certain employees. For example, you have an employee that will come into the break room, want to sit at a particular table, and a group will close ranks, not letting them join them. Bullying, yelling, cursing, and any of those can be done publicly or privately, or just basic mean or unpleasantness. All of these could create a hostile work environment, and all of these must be looked at and scrutinized in a way that we are excluding and rooting those out of our workplaces. Power harassment is one of the harassments that, one of the types of harassment that we see quite commonly. This would be a boss or a manager over a subordinate, or even someone that just has perceived power. So one of the ways we look at this is someone that places impossible demands on a subordinate to make them feel inferior, or to cause them to fail, or to push them out of employment. A lot of times we see this where they will publicly humiliate, making comparisons. Oh, well, if John were just as good as Jane performing his task, he wouldn't be in trouble all the time. Many times it takes the form of personal life. Well, John has so many problems in his personal life, it's no wonder he's a basket case at work. These are all forms of power harassment and need to be addressed so that they don't become larger harassment issues. Psychological harassment. This is one of the things that can happen when someone is isolated, turned into a pariah, outcast from the group. It happens when contributions are trivialized, when someone may work very hard to only achieve mediocre results, and those results are trivialized. They try to participate in group settings, and those ideas that they present are belittled. We will see some power harassment also in the psychological harassment, where intimidation tactics are deployed, where even a coworker can become boastful or braggadocious and intimidate the other person into silence or submission. Psychological harassment, one of the most common things that we see in a workplace is gossip. And what gossip can do not only to the morale in a workplace, but also to the individuals that are the victims of the gossip. Now, in this information age, we have a newish harassment called cyber harassment. Cyber harassment often works for mass humiliation. So public posts, False claims on social media. The buzzword is cyberbullying. This can be in the form of not only media posts, but texts. It can be public or private. And these are all activities that should be managed from the workplace, even when they're engaged in outside of the workplace. We also have retaliation harassment. And retaliation harassment is where one employee reports another employee for harassing. Jane goes to the manager and says, John was harassing me, and explains in detail what the harassment was. The manager calls John, and John says, well, I was only harassing her because she harassed me first. This is one of those tit for tat or payback. If you're going to throw me under the bus, I'm going to take you with me. The employee may up the ante, making the alleged crime of the accuser greater than his or her own alleged crime. This is one that needs to be investigated and quelled quickly, as these can escalate and become very ugly as other employees become involved. Third-party harassment. This is one of my favorites because it's one of those that we don't have a lot of control over, but in our workplace, it is our job to address harassment of any kind. In one workplace, I had a UPS delivery driver that would come to our premises every day. And we had several young ladies that were working on our dock. The driver would come, seek these ladies out. At times, I understand that he would say inappropriate things to them. When this was reported to me, I picked up the phone, called his boss, and told the boss, hey, if your employee engages in this type of harassment in my workplace again, they will not be allowed on our property. The situation was resolved very quickly, and for about 6 weeks, we did not see that particular delivery driver again. When we did see him again, his visits were very brief and very professional. So don't think that just because the harasser isn't a direct employee that it cannot be addressed. It should be addressed on all occasions. Okay, these are the typical harassment cases. And we'll just use the example where an employee is fired or denied a job or a benefit because they refused to grant sexual favors or because they complained about harassment. Retaliation for complaining about harassment is illegal, even if it can't be proved that the harassment actually happened. We have constructive discharge, which is where an employee quits because he or she can no longer tolerate the offensive work environment. If it's proven that a reasonable person under like conditions would resign to escape the harassment, the employer may be responsible for the resignation of the employee as if the employee had been discharged. This is one that we need to make sure that we're guarding against. What will happen is someone will quit. They'll allege that they only quit because the work environment was intolerable. If a judge rules in their favor, you may have to reinstate them as an employee, and you would also be on the hook for whatever wage they would have earned while they weren't working. So that can be one of those very expensive mistakes, to think that just because someone's quit, that your worries are gone. Not necessarily. The last one, an employee is exposed to an offensive work environment, exposure to various kinds of behavior or unwanted sexual advances. Just those alone may constitute harassment. So, what we take from this is don't do it. Don't harass. So, hostile or offensive in sexual harassment is making unwelcome sexual advances or other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature with the purpose of, or that creates the effect of, unreasonably interfering with an individual's work performance or creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. And this type of harassment typically comes from coworkers. I'll give you an example from a distribution type environment. There are employees throughout the warehouse picking orders. We had the problem where a male order picker would follow closely behind a female order picker, and as she would bend down to pick items from a lower shelf, he would come behind her and rub up next to her to pick items from a shelf above her. This would be considered hostile or offensive sexual advance or sexual harassment. Without opening his mouth to say a word, he has violated her personal space and made a hostile work environment and a problem that then has to be managed. So as we look at sexual harassment, the categories or the different parts of sexual harassment come from unwelcome advances, requests for sexual favors. Another quick example of that, had a supervisor that was in charge of a few temporary workers as well as the normal workers he was in charge of. Outside of the workplace, he started texting in what he alleged was a consensual sexual texting back and forth. This temporary employee reported him to the temp agency. The temp agency contacted me as the manager. I approached this individual, the supervisor, and he stated that it was a consensual texting relationship. I asked him to produce the text so that I could see that it was consensual. I had copies of the texts that she had shown her employer, and those did not look consensual. He was unable to produce any text that showed that it was consensual and was terminated for sexually harassing a subordinate. Other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature, that would be the instance that I cited before of the order pickers. It must be severe and pervasive. Also making threatening reprisals after negative response to sexual advances. Leering, sexual gestures, displaying of suggestive objects, pictures, cartoons, or posters. Gone are the days where a mechanic can have a calendar of naked ladies in his toolbox, as that could be a catalyst for a harassment issue in that workplace. unreasonably interferes with an individual's performance at work, creates a hostile work environment. Focus is on the impact of the behavior, not the intent. So many times you'll have employees that will come and they'll say, well, that's not how I meant it. So they'll make a crude joke or they will mock someone, and the excuse will be, I didn't intend to offend. But the focus is on the impact of the behavior, not what they intended. So if it caused offense, whether they intended it or not, that's where the focus should be. You don't have to have sexual desire to have sexual harassment. Just being in someone else's space can be considered enough. The last one we'll talk about a little bit here is the quid pro quo, the tit for tat, or this for that. This type of sexual harassment happens when a supervisor or other authority conveys to a subordinate through words or actions that he or she must engage in sexual conduct in order to advance or not receive poor treatment, conditions, and employment benefit or continue employment on the employee's willingness to perform sexual favors. Now let's go back to my story of the supervisor with his temporary subordinate. This supervisor, in this case, had gone to the temporary worker and said, allegedly, if you will perform a sex act on me, I will put in a good word with the boss and get you hired quickly as a full-time employee. This is exactly the definition of quid pro quo. You do something for me, I'll do something for you. So, illegal discrimination, the definition is when someone is treated unfairly because of the protected class status. In discrimination, two things must be proven. First, the employee suffered harm, or in other words, something bad happened to the employee. They were fired, disciplined, denied benefits, demoted. It has to be something that they can prove. And we also have to have motive that caused the harm related to the protected class to which the employee belongs. So this is where the discrimination and the protected classes come into play. Race, sex, age. Now that doesn't mean if the employee is not a member of any protected class that there wasn't discrimination. It's just the burden of proof will shift. So reporting harassment or discrimination, we're always here to help at XAMPP. If anyone believes there is harassment in their workplace, they can contact us. We can come, we can do an official investigation of the harassment. We can interview and take statements and help you come to a conclusion on what should be done to eliminate harassment from your workplace. If any employee observes sexual harassment by another employee, supervisor, manager, or non-employee, these should be reported immediately to any of the individuals listed on this page or to a manager. So why do we care about harassment and harassment policies? Well, an HR person or a manager or an owner that's acting in an HR capacity can be personally liable for their inactions. Failure to address harassment and to do what a reasonable person, and there's that word that we're going to talk about in just a second, failure to address and do what a reasonable person would do can make you personally liable for the harassment. So the law of negligence defines that the standard as the level of care that a reasonable person would exercise in a similar situation. So here's the example. It's reasonable for a motorist to follow traffic laws, including the speed limit. So the reasonable person is not an actual person. They're actually part of the family of hypothetical figures in law, including the right-thinking member of society, the officious bystander, the reasonable parent, the reasonable landlord, and the fair-minded and informed observer. So, reasonable person comes from criminal and tort law to denote a hypothetical person in society who exercises average care, average skill, average judgment in conduct, and who serves a comparative standard for determining liability. Often I'm asked, what would make a reasonable person? Well, we think about in a jury of peers, when they're deciding a case, that is often what they're asked to decide against is a reasonable person. One of the cases from the 90s that was quite famous was the lady that was burned by McDonald's coffee. And the jury awarded her, I think, $260 million in punitive damages for the coffee burn. Now, that's not what McDonald's paid, but that's what the jury said they would like to award. People ask, would a reasonable person allot that much money, award that much money in that type of case? And most people would say, well, no, that's outrageous. Everybody knows coffee's hot. So what would a reasonable person allege? Well, as you read into the story, in this case, this lady did have quite severe burns that necessitated skin grafts. But what's reasonable in that case? Of course, it's reasonable to cover her medical expenses, to cover whatever lost wages she would have had as she's in the hospital for her treatment. But how much blame do we put on the individual as a reasonable person? So those are all questions that we think about as we go into what makes reasonable people and how that definition is set.